Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, colleagues. Welcome to the final session of the International Migration Law Learning Platform, collaboratively presented by the IMBR Initiative. My name is Ian Kissel. I direct that initiative at Cornell Law School. ICVA, the International Coalition of Voluntary Agencies, and the NGO, or the Civil Society Action Committee. I want to draw your attention to the fact that this session is both being recorded and that there is interpretation available. Before I introduce our distinguished speakers, I want to underscore that interpretation is available in French, Spanish, and in English. Please click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom window and select your preferred language. To hear the original audio, select off. If you do not hear the speaker, please click on the interpretation button at the bottom of the window and select off. Colleagues, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. First, we will hear from Felipe Gonzalez Morales, currently the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants. Felipe, it is a pleasure to welcome you to this session. I will briefly share that Special Rapporteur Gonzalez Morales was appointed in 2017 by the Human Rights Council, and so therefore many of you will have seen his work in the mandate. He is a professor of international law at Diego Portales University in Santiago, Chile, where he is also the director of the Masters in International Human Rights Law, and so sending his students into the field as well. We had the special pleasure of collaborating while he was Commissioner and Rapporteur on Migrants at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the human rights body of the Organization of American States, and served as president of that body from 2010 to 2011. Welcome, Professor Gonzalez Morales. Next, we will hear from Professor Maya Sahi Fadel, the Commissioner and Special Rapporteur at the African Commission for Human and People's Rights. Madam Sahi Fadel has been teaching law at the law faculty of the University of Alger since 1981, as also teaches at the Diplomatic Institute of International Relations and the National School of Magistrates, so likewise sending her students into our field to do justice. She had previously practiced law in Algeria. In addition to being a member of the Commission on Human Rights and People since 2011 and serving as the Rapporteur on Refugees, Asylum Seekers, Migrants, and Internally Displaced Persons, she served as a member of the Working Group on the Death Penalty and the Working Group on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and for a number of years was a member of the United Nations Working Group and Expert Group on People of African Descent. I had the pleasure of collaborating recently with Professor Maya Sahi Fadel in her capacity as a Global Public Voices Fellow at Cornell, where I teach, and it is my pleasure to open this session. As both of our speakers know, but perhaps not all of our participants know, this is the closing session of a year-long learning platform for NGO colleagues around the world. Our zero session was open to the public and focused on the human rights of migrants during the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. And this, our closing session, focuses on advocacy strategies to promote the rights of migrants. And we have likewise opened this session to all colleagues. The recording of the entire series is available on the Action Committee's website, and we will share links to that as well as other materials throughout the webinar. We have just under 90 minutes for our discussion. I've asked Special Rapporteur Gonzalez Morales to begin, and then Special Rapporteur Sahi Fadel to continue on the theme of advocacy strategies. We'll take approximately 40-45 minutes for those presentations, and then open the balance to question and answer from civil society colleagues. Colleagues should feel free to use the chat function to share their questions in advance. And now, without further ado, please let me thank you once again for your participation this morning and ask you, Special Rapporteur Gonzalez Morales, to begin. Thank you.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I would like to thank Jan and the organizers for this invitation. I'm glad to be in this panel with Commissioner, Special Rapporteur Maya Salifadel, and to have a fruitful discussion with the participants. I am going to make my presentation in Spanish, so please arrange the interpretation for this. Voy a comenzar explicando cómo funciona.
Explain what it is, the functions that a reporter does, or especially a reporter that does on human rights for all of the migrants in the United Nations, and what it is. This is the career that I present now, and also I'm going to refer us to what are the main topics that rapporteur has been doing for over the last couple of years. What are the prospects of the job itself? This, of course, as you can see, will also include all the reference that the work we have been doing, the work that the United Nations does, the social civility, and all that it does related to what I do. And I can also make some observations if we have some time. I will point them out about how North America has worked as an organization, as a system, and how has worked as a commissioner and as a opportunities. So in the first, when it comes to the function of what I do with human rights for all of migrants, this is basically similar to what we have been doing, that we have seen for all of the special process that we have been doing, but I think that it has the human rights in the human nations. It means the special commissioners, the independent processes, and the working groups. The first that we have to say is that these rapporteurs or this commission, when it comes to migrants, it's a universal work that we're doing. It means that this doesn't just depend on what a state can do, what the state has said or not. This is very important when it comes to all the migrant system, because it works in all of the countries in the global north, including, for example, the United States, Canada, Europe, and many others that are in the north area, like Australia, for example. They haven't really said what is that we have to do, and what is the problem with the families that we have seen. What is the treaty that we have been doing? We see that the treaty has been seen like very little process, and we have seen like less than a fourth part with all of the UN. And this is a very important work that we have to do with what everything goes down to report. And this is the only real organization that we can do when it's related to like migrants, immigrations, and the human rights, and everything that has to do with the United Nations. Of course, as you can imagine, this is something that we can see, and there are many other people that can help us. They will have an approximation, for example, like everything that has to do with like the slavery, racism. These are things that we have to tackle depending on the perception that each state has, but it all depends on the perception that is a migrant. Now, as a special reporter, my function, well, I do it as an independent work. None of us who's working as a reporter is really like a functionary within a special nations, and we're not designated by any state from which we're working with. We're not really doing it from anyone else. We're doing it from within ourselves. And honestly, not being a member of the United Nations can be seen as a plus. And this means that we don't have the income that we have to value ourselves. So, of course, we have to handle it and make some juggles in order how to be able to support ourselves and also keep being able to do our job as a reporter. But I think that doing this ensures that we can actually work. And I think this is plus working as a reporter. One of the main functions that we have, everyone who's working as a reporter, especially when it comes to migrants, it's the information elaboration of like all topics that we have to handle. In this sense, we just finished and we just presented, I literally just did it with the human rights nations, and a very special report about what happens in Calvin, or some pushbacks, as well, we can say. And these are actions that we see that even if we don't want to really have some people that have the rights ready, or some people that are not prepared, it doesn't matter what they're doing or what are the actions they have. Everyone has a right to be helped. But we see that this doesn't happen all the time. So another topic that we have tackled in all of our reports in the recent years is, for example, what is the gender that we see in migrants? In a way to really tackle what is the difference in gender that we see in all of migrants. And this is something that we have seen how it has risen and the impact that it has in all migration over the world, especially over the last 3 years. And this refers explicitly to what we have been doing for the last time. And in this topic, we have presented two reports, one on human rights about the genders of migration, and another one, the General Assembly of the ONU in New York. And what are the good practices and what are the obstacles that we still have for the protection of the human rights of the women who are migrating, and how we can consider how we can actually help them out in all the migrations. I also feel that it was relevant, the report that was presented 3 years ago about the access of justice for all of the migrants. And because this has a lot of range in different situations that we see on a legal area, on a right to be interpreted, access to be seen to by a judge and be defended by someone else, and a series of many other topics that we saw that are, of course, very relevant for the planet. Then we also saw there that the United Nations is seen as like a sanctuary, or it's known as that, and that is what we see, for example, in Europe, like some firewalls that we can say that, or how we refer to it. And we have to establish a separation between the public services and the migrant agencies so that we can be able to allow a migrant person to be able to go to a judge, to a school, to a hospital, or any public service without having any care about what the situation is, or fear or being persecuted because of what their migration is. In this sense, we have really pointed out what are the problems that, or what is exactly the function of a firewall or a sanctuary, and why is it, and this is why they're absolutely necessary and indispensable for what it is that we're doing. And just like that, we have a long list of really long reports of all of this topic that we have prepared. All of the years we present something new on human rights. We keep presenting that to the assembly. And the next one that I will present in October is going to be about COVID-19, and I don't know which topic I'm going to be talking, but it's specifically how it has affected migrations, and how also not only that, but like the climate change in migrant situations. As you can see, this has changed, and in this aspect, the elaboration of special reports and the contribution that we have within the United Nations is very important. In fact, if you actually check what is that we do and we see any report, you will find a really vast reference about all the contributions that we have been able to do, or the several organizations that have done this. And this is very important when a non-governmental organization and what is that they do. These are the references that we have, for example, universities or any other centers of research that speak about it. So these are the vehicles, or like the ways that allow us to analyze everything and be able to provide a special report. And when we're talking about a migrant and any kind of report, it's really valid. Of course, as we can imagine, states and many other entities of the United Nations also make contributions relevant to the topic at hand. Another function that we have, the special reporters, is the one of like making visits to different countries and make the report about that specific visit that we did. I would say on those topics that we have to make a distinction about what is that we do when making a report, and then what is the non-official visit that we do, because most of those visits that we do are not really official, and that's where we do contacts, we get in touch with the civil state and actually get to know. That's why it's very important function that the civil society does. Unfortunately, the pandemic hasn't really allowed us to continue the visits. And again, sadly, we couldn't continue doing, for example, like the Central America. I don't know what happened in Africa. I don't know what happened there. But here we have been able to do some virtual visits that has allowed us to be, while it's not physical, it's still a visit. And we're still we still make a schedule, we still make a report based on that visit, and it's still pertinent to what we're doing. The Central American Commission, just like the report, does need an invitation to be able to do that. A lot of times we are the ones who ask that them to do that. For example, I just make for that. As I said, we have to do it and have a report being done. And many times, for example, we're working with Trump, we weren't able to get any kind of response by them. And that's why I kept saying to the administration, hey, now with Biden, I hope that this situation doesn't happen again and that we can actually keep going with the visits and then maybe being able to make a report about all of the migrants that are going to the United States. But talking about that, when it comes down to preparation for the visit, all of the people are going to be there. We have felt, even on a physical level, how it has changed. And then making that visit, it's really important to see how the interaction matters with the civil organization. And I think that it's easier if I just make the connection right now with the Central American civilians, because when it comes down to that commission, you could see that right now it's very analog what we're doing there. But there also exists, when it comes down to the Central American Commission, is that once the visit is done, during the preparation of the report, which can take some very considerable time, especially over there, but you could see that you can have some audits on a very specific topics so that we can have some follow-up with the visit and make sure that the report is on time and really on topic of what we're talking about, not just about the one we did back many years ago, but actually something that he's still doing and has an effort about the topic that we have to do today. This is why, thanks to these audits and thematic audits, we report it so that we can be able to have more visits. And then we have a dynamic, or see a dynamic that it has a feedback on it. And when it comes down with the United Nations, of course, it's not really possible to do some sort of like audiency or being able to be there for obvious reasons. This is not, what you see is that people go, or you have someone who's like on a representation of someone else, someone who represents the New York Assembly or something. But that's when we see the observations of every country. And then when we actually talk with those people, even though it's not the most valid person or not the way we want it, we actually saw how it is that we're doing and we get motivated to keep going. And then we can see that thanks to the pandemic, even though it has closed us, we still are able to meet on a virtual level. We can continue to talk with Ginebra or New York. Then what exists is, on the case of the migrant report, is a system that has to do with communication with the state. These are not cases that end when the communication is silly. It doesn't always end with a resolution. This doesn't always lead with like an end with is to sex, which means like ending in a resolution of conflict. But what happens? Organizations or civil organizations that work with people, maybe they send some requirements for the people who are making the report, and they ask that there is some intervention on a social standard. This might happen or occur for something that occurs for one person, for a group of people. This could even be for a person or a group that is just individual or not individual at all. This could be in regarding to a later law or some better law. So the report, what's going to happen is that they will send, based on what has been spoken and what has been reported, follow up to that state, and then using a letter, they will talk about it, and we will see based on that letter and if the topic was solved or handled properly, so that the state can actually see what has been said, and we really need an answer for this topic really fast. And based on the answer of the state, if we see that it's satisfactory, well, the topic is closed. Even if it's still something that could be openly discussed, but if it's allowed to be solved fast, or if it's like something in the other side that is not properly resolved, then what's going to happen is that then we're going to have another communique. That's what's going to happen, is that it's going to be divided. If it's something urgent that is not going to, if it's something that doesn't happen properly, then we're not going to have to wait, and it's going to be related to the situation. So what happened then is, depending on that function, it relates to the communication issues that we may have, the legal situation, this is a civil society, and that's where we see the importance of all of them and what you or everyone can do. The other thing that, or the other thing that I feel that have to be said with report and on an activist level is what are the processes that have to do with like many senses or with everything that has to do with migration and the human rights. On this aspect, when I started as a reporter on the 2017 was the preparation for the global impact for migration and be able to ensure an organization, an organized process for it. Then in December of 2018, I had to continue, and now we're on the first years of implementation of this specific idea. So this is where we see the interaction with the social sensitivity, and we have seen the very interaction within reporter and also the society, the state, and all of the United Nations. As you can see, we, the reporters, are not really an agency, but we do help. So what happens with the social civility? Well, they actually work as a way to support the process. And you could say that they fed the process in order to have a global impact, to emphasize what has been the report. What was the global impact and what needed to be said? Because it's not about the human treaty, it's about an instrument that has to do with a significant complement and a significant point for the human rights. And that's where the society had a very important matter. You could see, or you could say rather, that thanks to the pandemic, we could actually see the global impact and we could actually see what was important about it, because we could actually see what happens when it's not being properly followed. We saw what happens in Europe, in the Pacific, and in Latin America. We saw all of the Arab states, and we are still working with, well, it was supposed to be next week, but I guess we're gonna have to postpone it for a little bit, the one with Africa. What was the contribution? And because there were some states that were supposed to be held there, but there we saw what was the role that you have to do there. And this still related to the United Nations, and this is still not just that, but like all of the states and what is the global impact that we have. We saw that a big part of the ON had to do that. It had to keep following and keep going forward. And now, if you allow me to say, pass it on or keep on, I can imagine that a lot of people in the United Nations, a lot of people that are from the United Nations can possibly have a problem. We could say that you don't need to go to the Congress. You don't need to just follow a rule. When it's related to the people, you can just report, and because it's still related to the global impact, and then have that. You don't need to just take it to the Senate. Well, I guess that's what I would say on a big aspect. I mentioned some of the topics that were related to the thing about our topic reports, and some of the topics that have been said. For example, on a very informed way about, for example, the way that migration has stopped some migrants that have been taken the rights from, and we see that this is something that has been very implemented on the States. Here in Latin America, we can at least say that it has decreased a little bit of that matter of like taking the rights away from migration, because we have seen such a massive migration with this. And when it all comes down to the stop of the children, so that children can go, that has also stopped. And that's all related to the report. We also see the hate speech, what it means, the reasons has been reported, how people see the hate, and how we can actually stop that.
O por otras vías, ¿no es cierto? Está la cuestión del acceso a los servicios públicos.
We also have the question of the access to resources for both immigrants with and without documentation. the firewall cities or sanctuaries are very relevant in this sense. Lastly, we also have the issue of the regularization of irregular migrants. What's the issue here? There is a very worrisome trend that has been going on for some 20 years in the north of the globe. We have not seen any massive regularization processes. The last process of this sort took place in the US under the Reagan administration. In Spain, the last massive regularization process happened with Zapatero in 2005, more than 15 years ago. In the EU, many temporary measures have been put in place as a result of the gravity of and seriousness of the current migrant situation. That is why some temporary regulations, some temporary allowance to stay in Europe has been granted during the pandemic. The case of Colombia was quite significant. They put in place a measure to regulate the almost 2 million of Venezuelans living in Colombia. This is the most interesting process that is being taken lately. And from our rapporteur office, we are promoting the regularization of migrants in the event of the pandemic. There is no need to regulate the presence of irregular migrants under international migrant law, but it is a human right need because migrants want to be able to access to a correct protection if they do not have papers. In the case of, for example, in Colombia, with the 2 million Venezuelans, obviously we need to put in place a solution that is long-standing and not a short-term solution. I'm going to stop here, but we can continue discussing this very interesting topic in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rapporteur Gonzalez Morales, and I will immediately turn the floor to you, Commissioner Rapporteur Salgado, and then we will open to Q&A. Thank you so much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Jan. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jan, and to all organizers. Thank you for this teaching session on the migrant right. I would also like to thank Mr. Felipe Gonzalez because this is the first time we're having the opportunity to meet, even though virtually. I'm very happy to meet you, Mr. Gonzalez, to discuss about problems that we have in common. So I will also use the same method used by Felipe, but I will base my intervention on the African concept. I'm the commissioner at the African human rights. So we have a regional African unity, which is a AU, which has many committees, and my committee is the Human and People's Rights. In Africa, we also have the specificity of people. The committee has 11 commissioners, and our role is to regulate. So we have a conventional role. We have a a text which is, we have a chart for African people's rights, and that deals with social and cultural rights. We also have generational rights. So our commission is derived from that charter, and our role is to put in place the implementation of the chart. We have 11 commissioners, and we represent states because we are covering states. We also use the UN methodologies. So I'm the rapporteur, the special rapporteur for AU on refugees, migrants, IDPs, and asylum seekers. So contrarily to the UN system, we have a special rapporteur on IDPs and a refugee. And there is also a UN system for refugees. But at the AU level, I cover both, three of the sessions. I'll focus my intervention on migrants, economic migrants, which is our focus. I will come back to the fact that the African region over the past years has been faced with IDPs, and the continent has many refugees and IDPs, of course. There is also a lot of mobility due to forced internal displacement. We also want to talk about migration issues in Africa, trying to contextualize it. The phenomenon of migration depend on the African and regional context. We know that there are 5 subregions in Africa, and each region has its own. We have some statistics that says that the number of people that migrate within and outside Africa is the same, although internal migration in Africa is higher than external one. So we have 4 migration dynamics on which I'm working. The first one is Afro-European, that is migration that starts from Northern Africa to Europe, so beyond the Mediterranean Sea. So that's the first one, but that's not the most important. We hear that most Africans are trying to migrate beyond the Mediterranean Sea. That's not true. Most migrations occur within Africa. The second migration is the sub-Saharan, that is migrants coming from sub-Saharan countries to the north. And there is also the West African migration dynamics that is quite similar to the sub-Saharan migration. It is the trend at the moment because the goal of that migration was to go through the Sahara to Europe. It has changed a little bit because the northern countries that used to be transit countries are nowadays become host countries. The Schengen issue is an hindrance to go beyond that border to Europe. There is a 4th dynamic, which is the East African dynamic. That is the Horn of Africa. So there is another route to Sudan or Egypt. There is also the South African dynamics. and South Africa is the host country over there. So there are many dynamics. Therefore, it is important to understand the context. As special rapporteur, and as far as our mandate is concerned, we have three main mandates, and I will focus on two. The first one is protection of human rights, and the second one is human rights promotion. I will start with protection as a special rapporteur on migrants. So I have to analyze the conditions of migrants, economic migrants, and IDPs, and also refugees. We have to state that as far as promotion is concerned, the question is, we have to find out the root causes of the migrations. There are many causes, such as economic causes. So the factor and context economic causes force people to migrate. We also have social causes, which are very important: lack of basic services, lack to access to health, are things that cause Africans to migrate. We also have demographic factors. We also have political factors, such as factors linked to bad governance. We also have poverty, bad governance quality that can promote discrimination within a nation, sometimes violation of human rights, persecutions that also force people to embark on the migration journey. We also have the environmental causes. We know that Africa is a continent that is prone to disasters. And among these disasters, we have problems of climate change, such as drought, deforestation, soil erosion, and scarcity of water resources that force people to leave their environment. So there are many many causes that make African young people to leave their countries. So what I do is to have interaction with CSOs to promote human rights through discussions with those organizations. There are many on the African continent. So we tell them that we need to be intermediaries, we need to be the bridge between nations, and explain to them that migration causes have to be resolved internally. On the other hand, in our mandates, we have the possibility to receive reports sent or drafted by countries and sent to the AU Commission. We can also have intersectional approaches as far as protocols are concerned. Protocols like the protocols concerning women. We also have the Kampala Convention. So sometimes there are reports produced by countries, and in those reports, there is nothing about migration issues. There is a kind of blockade around the question. So my mechanism and my team have to question nations about their policy is concerned as far as hosting or welcoming project refugees is concerned. On the other hand, when it comes to protection, this is an important point. There are divergences of points between of opinions between states. That's what Felipe just said. We stress violation of migrants' rights. We ask the question, is there any law that protects migrants? Felipe said that we have the Convention of the UN on laborers, workers. It means those who are allowed legally to work in a country. What about the economic issues that force some people to leave their country through some pathways and who will eventually be exposed to persecutions? That's why, as part of my mandate, I've worked on some resolutions to call on states on the issue of migration. And one of the resolutions, which was one of the most important ones, is the 2007 migration and human rights. I contributed to making this law adopted. So I worked on the question, and it is stated that from the AU Charter, we have the right to movement, the right to life, the right to enjoy movement. So we realized that all these rights were being violated. Therefore, we called on nations to promote the protection of those rights. Another resolution was that of the 2015, which was about the degradation of Mediterranean African migrants, because we realized that a lot of migrants were leaving the African coast to go to Europe. Unfortunately, they were being faced with dangerous situations on their way to Europe. And in our declaration, on our statement, we express our concern, pointing out the death of many of the migrants, the candidates to migration. So we called on nations to work with European countries. Thereafter, we had the 2016 revolution on the migrant situations in Africa. And we stressed, we put an emphasis on women, children, migrant sexual exploitation, and finding solution to detention. We also denounced the way migrants were being detained. So we called on nations to mitigate the effect of such a situation by putting into place measures that will promote payment of damages in case rights are violated. We also had the 371 resolution on refugees, on migrants. There were other resolutions that were taken in 2018 and 2019. And that of 2018 was particularly important because it pointed out the challenges to migrants protection. We realized that all the people going through the Sahara to the north were being maltreated, persecuted, especially women, unaccompanied women. And we also realized that migrants were being detained. So that resolution was taken when we heard that the migrants were being detained in bad situations, poor situations. So this is the work I do on the daily basis to study conditions of migrants in Africa. That is why in 2018, I decided to work on a study on the violation of migrants' rights. I conducted this region in a particular the main route for migrants to the north. So I conducted this research with the Danish Institute for Human Rights, and the study is available. In that study, we work on a number of migrants in that region who told us about the violations of their rights from that point to Libya, and how they were being exploited by those who organized the trade. So we also organize workshops to sensitize people, of course, with CSOs. I also had to contribute, also contributed to listen to returnees who told me how they were being treated, they had been treated in Libya. So during each ordinary session of our commission, we have a panel of discussion on refugee migrants' conditions. I also collected some testimonies from migrants who explain their situation in host countries. When I talk about the issue of migrations, we have the possibility to work with the AU. As I mentioned earlier, we are an entity of the AU. We work with the former Department of Political and Human Affairs that deals with migration issues. And the AU pondered on the framework, the Banjul Migration Framework that was drafted in 2004 and revised in 2018. We now have a new compact on migration. We therefore see migration not as a burden, but an opportunity for economic development for nations. From 2016, there have been reflections on how nations could open their borders to welcome migrants. And there was laws that were drafted. We had the protocol on free trade. We also have another protocol, which is the protocol on free movement. And there is a misunderstanding. On one hand, African nations welcome the free trade without accepting the other one, which is free movement. And as you know, there can be free trade without free movement. And countries have very rigid points of view. They don't want to accept or welcome migrants, yet that could be an economic potential for them. So the discussions are ongoing to encourage nations to adopt or ratify the protocol on free movement that will foster economy. On the other hand, I would like to talk about what we call the normative framework in Africa. As of now, we have the African Charter, we have international frameworks on human rights. We also have a general observation on the Article 12 of the AU Charter. very soon I will complete the article by adding general comments for the UN. I also touch on the rejection of migrants. So during the COVID pandemic, we've worked a lot, though virtually, on the issue of migration, because many countries, particularly those in Eastern Africa, closed down their borders to migrants. Of course, they argued that it's for health issues. But one thing is to note, even people that were in the country were facing issues when it comes to access to vaccine, and there were also discrimination against some citizens and migrants. We also told some nations that they did not take into account the condition of migrants in their policies against their response against migrants. I just finished a paper on migrants protection. It is a study that was conducted with other NGOs. And let me mention here that NGOs that are working with me are very relevant. And I'm sure the study will be adopted by AU and it will be launched during one of our AU ordinary sessions. I would like to take advantage of this of this meeting to invite Mr. Felipe Gonzalez to be during the launch, whether virtually or in presence. I would also like to state that my mandate goes beyond protection. We also make sure the global compact on migrants is being reinforced. I worked with a lot of panels, discussion panels in Marrakesh about this project. And throughout this week, there are a lot of meetings on this compact. Today, there was a meeting with ECOWAS on the same compact. Unfortunately, I was not able to take part because I was in a meeting concerning the Tigray region. It's very important to note that many actors are working at the moment on the issue. There is a debate on the implementation of the Global Compact on Migrants. We are still interacting with our partners about the importance of NGOs. We have more than 400 NGOs that have the status of observers with the AU. There are also NGOs among them that are working with me on the issue of migration. And I will welcome the questions of participants. Once again, thank you to the participants and the organizers of this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rapporteur González Morales and Commissioner Rapporteur Sá.
Muchas gracias a todos los reporteros, los orantes. Realmente ha sido algo muy vasto y
host you in this closing session of our year-long program. Colleagues, just a reminder that interpretation is available and therefore feel free to intervene with your questions in the chat in the language of your choice. I wanted to begin with a question for both of the rapporteurs. Rapporteur González Morales, in your tenure as Commissioner in the Inter-American System, you began work that concluded now 2 years ago with the adoption by the Commission of a set of principles on the rights of all migrants, refugees, stateless persons, and victims of trafficking in the Americas. Commissioner Sakhli Fadel, the African Commission recently adopted a resolution directing the rapporteurship to prepare a study and a set of guiding principles similarly on the rights of all migrants, refugees, stateless persons, victims of trafficking, and in the context of your mandate, potentially those who are internally displaced. I noted both of you discussed the Global Compact on Migration, and Commissioner Sakhli-Fadel, you also referenced the New York Declaration. Certainly these documents recognize the universality of the protection of the rights of all migrants that anchor, Rapporteur Gonzalez-Morales, your mandate. What can you share about your view of the importance of the development of uniform principles that protect all migrants, regardless of their cause of their movement across borders, as a tool for advancing the protection of the rights of migrants? Is this a goal that civil society should pursue? What questions or opportunities do you see these kinds of initiatives posing for the broad goal of enforcing the rights, the universal rights of migrants at the global and regional levels? Thank you again for your presentations. I will open that question to both of you, perhaps in the order in which you spoke. And then again, I will emphasize to colleagues that you can please put your questions in the chat and we will continue with our dialogue. Thank you.
Bueno, me parece que como ha quedado claro de la presentación.
I think that, as we have discussed previously, my partner has already mentioned it, and I hope that my own presentation has already said, is that there's a very important interaction between the standards of all of the UNs and also the regional standards that we all see with all of the migrations. And this is something that has affected the human rights. And we can see that there's like a constant feedback that we have to keep, and it's very important that this standard keeps going. And that continues with the migrations, and that we also improve ourselves on a regional level, on the UN levels. So we see that there has to be some feedback. And we hope that this continues in all directions. When it comes down to the Central American system, there isn't really a treaty that is in relation to human rights for all the migrants. Maybe the Human Rights Convention and the American Rights for Men of the United States might have said something. That has something to do with it, but there isn't really a treaty itself that has something to do with it. So saying that really is something that is very important, and we have to be explicit about the things that we're saying, and maybe we have to take some other ways into consideration as the Central American Convention has done. We have seen people with different situations, different mobilities, and we have to rely on the different ways that they can do in relation to this topic. And also, when it comes down to all of the legal terminology, when it comes down to everything related to all of the cases that we see in all of these conventions and more, but the systemization of this idea and all the instruments that we have, for example, the principles of the Central American rights, is something that is really important for me. That's what I think.
Commissioner Sakhli-Fadel.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Merci également pour votre question.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. I think it's also important to develop in the African continent, as my colleague Mr. Gonzalez said, texts
law on
migrants issues. We use the African Charter. We also talk about international migrants' rights. It is true that we are still working on what we call soft law texts. We want to gather comments from various stakeholders, but I can assure you that we are actively looking for principles that could benefit migrants. We know that we are going to start the first phases very soon to actually have our own instrument at the African level. But I can assure you that you cannot divide migrants laws or rights, sorry, from various regions. The, the, the rights are still the same. What we want to do now is to develop something that will enable migrants to benefit from international, regional text, regional instruments. And what is really important for us now is to make sure that these principles are owned by the states, especially African states. Well, we will start with campaigns, advocacy campaigns around these principles, because I think that very soon, that's about in a year, we're still starting the process, the drafting process. We'll know that these principles will actually acknowledge the presence of the migrants and the rights. I also wanted to commend what Mr. Felipe Gonzalez said. I wanted to tell him that they exist between the African Commission and the High Commission of the United Nations. Since you belong to this commission, a roadmap, the Addis Ababa roadmap. This is the roadmap we use to interact with your commission. I know that we've not yet invited you in our round meetings, but I know that it's going to happen very soon. We talked to Ms. Cecilia Jimenez. We also talked to the work group on forced displacement and enslavement. And I think that very soon, when we organize our next meetings, I'm sure it's going to be a virtual meeting. I will invite you because I know that we have to share a lot of information together, because I know that whether we are in Asia, in America, in Africa, migrants are vulnerable people. They need to be protected by the same principles, by the same laws. And I know that Africa is still lagging behind, but we count on your participation. We count on your collaboration to exchange ideas and foster our collaboration.
Thank you both for this response to this question. And I certainly hope that this is the beginning of a dialogue between your mandates, and I'd be happy to speak more offline about this possibility. I've noted several questions in the chat, and I want to begin with two questions, and you can choose to address them. I will similarly ask you to intervene in the order that you've spoken, and again invite colleagues to intervene in the chat with additional questions. One is about prioritization of resources. Where would you propose our civil society colleagues focus or strengthen their advocacy to benefit migrants? This is an intervention from our colleague Mirella Shutariki. The second is drawing on the intervention of our colleague Vladimir Pascual Revello, which related to racism and xenophobia. And I wonder whether you can, either in the context of this first question or separately, speak about the importance of prioritizing work to counter racism and xenophobia, and how civil society can prioritize this in a year in which this has been much discussed at the global and local level around the world, and certainly was the subject of just a call in recent weeks by the UN Secretary General to address the legacy of slavery as it relates to discrimination. So those would be the next two questions, and I give you the floor again in the order of previous interventions. So Rapporteur Gonzalez Morales, thank you.
And thank you to my colleague here for the invitation so that we can have a meeting here, that we can, I think that's something amazing that we could do. I think that if we have a mechanism of human rights on a global spectrum and regional spectrum, and her report on migration, I believe that would be very interesting, that we could maybe organize something together, since it's the topic that's the report that I'm talking about, and I'm going to be presenting on October. So I think that would be interesting. And in relation to the questions, well, the first one is very vast and very ambiguous on how to refer itself when it comes down to intervention. But how can a civil organization interact, and how can it like interact with the migration and other mechanisms that we have in the human rights, in the UN and all of the different sectors that it does? And I think that all of its sections are very interesting, and everything that is related to it is very important for every country, specifically with all of the individual situations, the collective cases, the laws, and everything that has to do with the laws of the human rights related to the migrants. And I can keep going and going and going. But what I would really, I guess, really point out is that it's important that the civil organization is very proactive, you know? It's not just about, well, the reporter is gonna decide to do this thing, so we're just gonna give him the information and be done with it. No, the civil organization has an influence, and of course the American influence. So everything can influence the agenda. So this is something that is very important to do. Like just take into account what the reporter is saying about a particular program, but also what will be the focus of what is to be said. Like they can interact with that and maybe mention some other things. About racism and xenophobia, well, here's the question that I saw way before it was synthesized by Jan, but it's a question that it was to me, I guess. But I guess why not make a report about xenophobia and racism in Europe? Well, what happened is that thematical reporters are something that is related to a global spectrum. But without that prejudice, I guess that it could have an emphasis on a very specific topic that a regional area or a country specific has to do, or something that's related to that. So the report related to the pushback, and it has to be done really like, it has to be on a hot topic, it has to be released and done. So when it comes down to European nation, well, I guess I was criticized by this, but it has to do with human rights. The thing is that this is exactly what I have to say. Like, this is what we're talking about. This is the regional organization that we see, and it's how we keep seeing the revolution keep going. So this is how we see how every country has its own point of view, and they do their own way. They do their own way, and it's all of it is very significant. So if we were to do a very specific report about racism and xenophobia, it wouldn't just be about Europe or Asia or something like that. But I guess we could emphasize all of the regions that we see that are actually affecting the process itself. And I guess I would like to refer about some that I saw in another question. And if I would be allowed by the moderator to do this, it's a question that it was in French. And I guess I understood, I'm taking a guess here. It was related, or I guess I could understand that if I read that fine, is that the European nation, or the Congress of the European nation, is that this didn't have an impact on the migration, and that's not true. It did have it. The thing is that the people that haven't adopted this system, like Hungary, or people that are against it, like Italy, who decided to abstain on other things, we see that those are the countries that have the most press, but almost every European state do actually have an impact on the migration. And on that topic, on that notion, we see that we're going on the face of like, we need to demand implementation of this. And I was talking about the United States and its global impact, because if you actually look at the timeline, you would see that in the 4 years of Trump, and we talk about the impact on its migration, we see that it would be a coherent and logical solution to talk about what's going on and in relation to how it can relate, or like we can compare it to the Obama like presidency. When Obama was on the run on 2006, from 2016, and its global impact, it was very crucial, and it had like a very important matter with the migration. So it would be coherent that now the administration of Biden would subscribe on migration and advocacy for this, I think.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Rapporteur Safi Fadel.
Merci beaucoup pour avoir posé la question sur le rôle.
Thank you very much for asking this question on the CSOs and how we can interact with them and how we can harmonize our activities. In Africa, we have ordinary sessions, and before these ordinary sessions, we have a forum with NGOs. They are invited for 3 days to discuss on migrations, and on the second day, they are interest groups. And I meet every single NGOs working on migration issues. Either because I want to get the direct report on human rights violation and migrants violations, and also because I want to actually set up cooperations with them, advocacy groups in the various countries, so as to encourage each government to develop national strategies on migration or migrant policies, or adopt laws on migrations. And this means that in Africa, some countries are reluctant to adopt these instruments, these mechanisms. So sometimes we have good ideas, but unfortunately, on the field, there is a lack of political will. So we need national laws, we need mechanisms on the field. So the reason why we work with NGOs is because we want to build their capacities, enable them to adopt advocacy strategies as to encourage the government to develop the mechanisms that would benefit migrants. We not only work with NGOs, actually, we work with national institutions on human rights. These are intermediaries between my office and the various governments. So these are human rights commissions, and they also work with NGOs on the field, that is, directly in these countries. So these are kind of intermediaries, and sometimes when we work with these organizations, we also have government of officers or officials. So I believe NGOs are really important, especially when we want to develop advocacy strategy on the protection of migrants' rights. As far as racism and xenophobia are concerned, we have the right to non-discrimination. This is part of the African Charter on Human Rights. And what we've noticed is that in Africa, migrants are also victims of discrimination, xenophobia. For instance, I'm sure you remember what happened in South Africa, because it was considered as xenophobia and discrimination. I can also mention Libya, where migrants, especially sub-Saharan Africans, were detained in camps. They were considered more as slaves just because of xenophobia and discrimination. I gather reports from people who came from Libya, and they told us that discrimination in Libya also affected migrants. So if you came from a different country, you'll be treated differently. So in Libya, it was actually a very big problem. So we wanted to denounce all these activities, all these acts, especially because we've noticed that in Africa, some government believe that xenophobia and racism cannot exist because we are a single continent. But the truth is, when people come to us, when they share the story with us, when we talk to CSOs, they always mention racism, they always mention xenophobia against migrants. So when I was presenting my speech, I think I also mentioned that we mention these problems in our various reports. So each time there is a General Assembly at the UN, or rather the AU, we also make sure to always highlight these concerns. And we also, in addition to these concerns, propose solutions, because each time there is a problem, it is always good to propose a solution. And these problems are not limited to xenophobia. There is also discrimination, lack of basic services, care, education, and sometimes people do not even get access to papers. They gave birth to children, but they are not allowed to have birth certificates, for instance. So I think we have a number of solutions to actually get all these governments on board, especially when we talk to the official representative. They actually want to work with us. They vividly participate in these activities. It is true that sometimes they are more politically correct, but their reaction means something to us. Because sometimes we notice that it's better than nothing. It's better to get these reactions than to get a backlash, for instance. So, racism and xenophobia are pressing concerns, and sometimes we have the feeling that, well, xenophobia is more important than racism, and it's a problem that is more noticeable when you go to Europe. But I think we should refocus our attention and actually deconstruct our prejudices and stereotypes about this question. Thank you very much.
Thank you both, Rapporteur Gonzalez Morales and Commissioner Rapporteur Safi Fadel, for those interventions. I will share just one final set of questions, and at the same time invite you, please, Rapporteur Gonzalez Morales.
Yes, I wonder if I can address one of the questions about pushbacks.
Certainly, I will perhaps in that sense, what I would do is I will share a final question and then invite each of you to address any other themes that have been discussed by either of the speakers or have been raised in the chat. And that, of course, can include the treatment of any of the recent work of your respective mandates. The broad question for both of you to close combines two that have come through in the chat. One is, if I can find my colleague here, from our colleague Frank Ianga, who asks about, his question is specific to the European Union, but I think I might broaden this question to just raise more generally the conflict or the potential double standard or the complexity between states who have not ratified core human rights instruments, and most in particular, the International Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and their Families, and yet have supported efforts like the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. Do you see a tension there, and how would you comment on that tension? And then an intervention that came from our colleagues at ANISUR and the Awash Foundation, which raises the potential tension between the traditional privilege of diplomatic protection, the notion that states would be primarily responsible for intervening with other states for the mistreatment of their nationals abroad, versus the need for individual remedies for individual migrants, either via the special mechanisms like your mandates or international or regional courts, and noting that in the domain of international human rights law, often it seems that only governments have rights and duties, and that individual migrants are without individual modes of redress. So very broad questions, so I invite your interventions on those two problematics or on any other matters as we close. We have 7 more minutes, so if I could ask you each to use about 3 minutes for this final intervention so that we close on time. Thank you so much, and I will come in to thank everyone at the close.
Bueno, de manera...
Well, really fast. Obviously, yeah, there is a very important relationship when it comes to double standard. And related to that, I guess the international treaties that had to do with like human rights, and that we have seen in most of the North countries, with the exception, some important exceptions, like for example, the European nation, can also be applied for the migrants. And that's exactly what we can do in a report. Sometimes the conventions about the racial discrimination, sometimes we see some political posture, some child rights. We can see many different points of view when it comes down to migrants. So this could also be applied to the migrant women, the migrant children, anyone, and even more. So we can actually start there. But this is standard that has to do, in my own opinion, with the fact that very recently, I guess, when we're talking about when we just adopted the global impact, it wasn't really clear what multilateralism meant with all of the migrants on a very compact level. We understood what refugees were, but not what was the point of like migrants and what was the multilaterality that we saw. There was always that tension present, like the state sovereignty versus the international state. So most states weren't really willing to do this. And I guess this is what really started the process that started on the last decade, on like human flow and everything that happened in there, Europe. And that's what made Europe finally become like, when it comes down to the heart of the European nation, like France, Spain, and more, to push, I guess, that treaty to actually become a reality. And we can see that the countries of origin actually started doing that too, because they wanted that. But in relation to the second question, I mean, this really makes me similar to about the pushback question that was said before, like what could be done? Like what could be done when it comes down to this? I think that this is a very basic thing that we have tried to do. And we tried to do that on the recent report. And like, we have to put some things on the table and make it clear, like the standards that we have to set up. Because honestly, I think that many of you can't even possibly imagine, but there's a normalization that is going on. The environment that we see is not what we see here. Like this webinar is not the most normal way of doing this. And between states, this thing that we're doing here doesn't really happen with the states. Unless it's something, that's really important, something that has to do with a very global thing, it happens. But more other things, like non-violent treaty, doesn't really happen because, for example, asylum seeking, refugee justice, states tend to not happen. Like they say, like, oh, this is normal. Why would we do something about it? And what happens is that they make like a second border in all of the territories. For example, in Malaysia, the United States, and all of the South region, what happens is that people who just cross the border, they really don't have all the rights. So, well, I mean, they're not gonna be in any regular right, but the person who actually just got that, they're gonna have an even lower right than others. And so I guess that's a very basic thing that we have to relate to when it comes down to pushback that hasn't been really standardized on a global spectrum. And states don't really talk about like migrations and I think that this that we have mentioned, I think that's something very good. This is what we have to do. Like those who are private, who don't have the rights, who were taken the rights and freedom taken away from them. So these are the center of things that we have to do. And these have been one of the topics that we have talked about. And it's not just a violation of right and practice, but also people who are not even seeing standards in the rights. It's like, I think this is a whole process that we have to do, and we have to get involved in universities. I think this is what we have to do. Thank you so much for the question.
Thank you, Special Rapporteur Gonzalez Morales. Commissioner Rapporteur Safi Fadel, you have the last intervention, please.
Merci. Je vais répondre à la première question.
Thank you very much. I want to answer the first question. Talking about the privileges that we mentioned later. I know that there are double standards, and this is what we call a mechanism that actually encourages certain countries to choose migrants, especially economic migrants. I'm not only talking as a special rapporteur. I know that in Europe, a few years ago, there were double standard policies. we noticed that certain refugees were granted access to these countries based on certain criteria. So I believe that these double standard policy should be banned because it's creating any more problems than solutions. Talking about your second question, I want to emphasize the fact that this compass is not legally binding. Many countries ratified the compass. They actually committed themselves to respect other international mechanisms related to human rights. But actually, what we asked all these African governments to do when we organized a meeting on this compass is to encourage them to develop their own mechanism so as to host migrants and respect the rights. And I think this is going to be very important for them to understand that migrants are not always people in need. They can actually help you develop your country. So what we want to do with these countries is to make sure that beyond the commitment, there are real actions behind. This is a mechanism, the compact, a non-legally binding instrument that can help countries to develop their own national policies on migrations. Because when we analyze this compact, this global compact, sovereignty is mentioned so many times. We know that many countries want to remain in charge. They want to preserve their own interests. We know that we take into consideration their role. We don't want to erase them from the equation. And that's why when we organize meetings, we want to educate them on their role in this whole process. We want to ask them, what did you do concretely to implement this global compass? I know that many countries in Africa will tell that, okay, well, we are still lagging behind. We're still thinking about how we can actually draft our own national policies. So I think it's very important for our various participants to understand that this is a non-legally binding instrument. When we mention sovereignty, we also want people to understand that they have the right to make their own decisions. As I said, many governments want to preserve their own power, and I mention here African states. Each time we mention migration, it's a very sensitive issue. It can even divide opinions. We notice that it's the same thing in the European Union. Since September, there are tension about migrations. There are various points of views because some countries want to welcome migrants where others want to actually block them in the borders. So I think I don't have enough time to explain it, but I know that it's very important to acknowledge the fact that migrants are not a problem. Thank you very much.
I think that this is a perfect note on which to close. The stressing of the possible contribution and every day of migrants to the lives of our communities. And I want to thank both of you for your contributions to the work to protect the rights of migrants and for taking time out of your busy calendars to present this work and to discuss with us how we as civil society can both engage your mandates and engage in this common effort. Thank you both, Special Rapporteur Felipe Gonzalez-Morales and Commissioner Rapporteur Maya Sahle-Fadel. It was a great pleasure, and I hope that this is the beginning of further dialogue among your mandates and with all of us in civil society. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance today.
Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. C'est moi qui vous remercie et merci encore d'avoir organisé ce débat.
Thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this discussion. I think we learned a lot from you today. Thank you very much.